These TDC and sort of intros are the best. Really impressive. Hi, welcome. Thanks for coming to this talk. It's so nice when people show up to your talk. So this is a talk about a meeting of two zombies, Agile and Architecture. So you have Architecture on the left side and Agile on the right side. Both undeniably dead, both undeniably still with us. We can pinpoint the death of Architecture fairly accurately. It was in the middle of February 2001. And the culprit was the guy on the right side. This is Agile. And for Agile, it's been more of like a gradual thing, right? So Agile has been in poor health for a while, and I think we can sort of state that it's dead now. But the nice thing about both being dead is that it puts them on equal footing. So we can have like an earnest conversation now, sort of like a blameless retrospective, a post-mortem, if you like, as we can sort of like have a conversation, not about who killed who, but sort of like what happened and why, and reminiscent about the good old days. So a few words about me. My name is Einar Høst. I am a Norwegian software developer. I have been making software for money for more than 20 years. I've been around for roughly as long as the Agile Manifesto, and I'm still alive. I work for Nordkart as a developer and architect. Our domain is Maps, which is really the coolest domain out there. It has the geographical information. We're sort of into it. Okay, so Agile and Architecture, there's a certain tension there. At least I feel that there's a tension there. So that Agile and Architecture are somehow at odds. Architects and Agile practitioners don't always see eye to eye. And so when you talk about Agile and Architecture, it's often, we often talk about like striking a balance, right? The need to strike a balance. And again, this plays into this notion that there is sort of like, that Agile and Architecture are sort of like opposites. So we get into weird discussions like how much architecture should we have? Which sounds a little bit odd to me, like you mean in kilograms or volume, or so what is the unit of measure for architecture? But I think the underlying idea here is that if you have too much of this stuff, it sort of becomes heavy and it stifles agility. And similarly, how much agility should we sort of like aim for? And that's equally strange kind of question, but I think maybe it translates into something like how much autonomy should teams be afforded. And the idea is something like if we afford teams too much autonomy, maybe things will sort of like fall apart and there will be chaos, and chaos is no good. So we would want just enough of architecture and just enough of agility in both cases. Not too little, not too much. So we want the right amount, but to me this is kind of like useless. I mean, it's true, we always want just enough of everything, right? But it's like a tautology. You can't really use this as a heuristic for anything, right? So how do you know that you have just enough? This is just like the Goldilocks principle, right? You want it to be the right amount. But I think our brains are sort of like hardwired to look for these sort of like balances and trade-offs, because trade-offs are much easier if you can sort of like put things on a scale and sort of like reject the extremes, right? And then there's something sensible in the middle, hopefully. But that sort of relies on the things actually being on a scale. And it's not clear to me that that's the case for Agile and Architecture. So for that reason, this is not the talk that I want to do. I want to do a very different kind of talk. I'm not going to talk about balancing agility and architecture. I want to start with why. Why are we talking about these things in the first place? So why are we talking about architecture? Why do we have such a thing as architecture? What are we trying to accomplish? What are the problems that we're trying to solve? And similarly for Agile, we have this idea of agility. Why do we have it? What are we trying to accomplish? Where does this come from? And I guess, like, why do anything, right? You do things, presumably, because you perceive that they bring some sort of value. And if something else brings more value, you do that instead. Or if something turns out doesn't provide any value at all, hopefully you stop doing it. So we should never do anything just because we are already doing it. Right? Agile and Architecture have been along for a long while, but that's not a good reason to continue sort of doing it. Right? So we need to ask questions like this. If architecture is the answer, what is the problem? And the same for agility. If Agile is the answer, what is the problem? And this is sort of like interesting to me, like an interesting question to ask is it the same problem? Are we trying to address sort of like the same thing, And if there's a common thread among sort of the problems that architecture and agility sort of try to address, I think we can trace this back to this software crisis. So the software crisis was a term that was coined in 1968 at a NATO software engineering conference. And the problem with software in 1968 was that projects were running over budget, over time, very inefficient, low quality, didn't meet the requirements, sometimes wasn't shipped at all. Very bad situation to be in. So there's this quote by a famous Dutch computer scientist called Edgar Dijkstra. I'm going to read all of this out loud. So it said that the major cause of the software crisis is that the machines have become several orders of magnitude more powerful, to put it quite bluntly. As long as there were no machines, programming was no problem at all. When we had a few weak computers, programming became a mild problem. And now that we have gigantic computers, programming has become an equally gigantic problem. Well said. This was 1972. Right? So it's fair to say that computers have become even more powerful since then, and also much more ubiquitous, so computers are everywhere. So I think we had this crisis for more than 50 years. I think we can trust that the crisis will continue to be with us, right? In a field that's sort of like constantly changing, this is a constant. We'll always be in some sort of crisis. And in fact, ambitions for what software is going to do are going to continue to rise. Software is already everywhere. It's going to be more densely everywhere. We're going to want ever more sophisticated software, and we're going to also want to do more for less. We're going to want it to become cheaper to produce this software. So how do we tackle this crisis? This was sort of the problem that in the 1970s, people like Edgar Dijkstra and David Parnas were talking about, sort of like how do we structure our programs? What is good program structure? And stuff like modular design. How should we sort of like partition our software? And this is a deep problem that we're still struggling with. Otherwise, microservices would have been a success. Right? And we wouldn't even have had to go to microservices because we wouldn't have the problem of the big balls of mud. So this is still a problem. There were high hopes for stuff like components. Right? Because the idea is that if software is difficult and expensive and hard to build, and there are lots of bugs and stuff like that, if we can have some well-made, well-tested, robust components, maybe we don't have to start from scratch all the time. So we can reuse those good components, and it's going to help address this crisis. In 1992, Perry and Wolf predicted that the 1990s would be the decade of software architecture. And I think they were right. Maybe even more right than they intended to be. I don't think they intended to say that software architecture has 10 more years to live. But okay, so 1990s saw the rise of the architect. What is architecture? And there's sort of like flippant joke, like architecture is what the architects do. And what does an architect do? Well, they tend to the architecture, right? So, but here's the definition. There are very many definitions of architecture. And I don't think that necessarily speaks sort of like ill of architecture, but it also doesn't necessarily speak like well of it either. So this one says, the architecture of a software system is its organization or structure, that's the structure word, of significant components interacting through interfaces, those components being composed of successively smaller components and interfaces. So you can see these important words with like structure and components and interfaces. This is the rational unified process definition of architecture. This is like my mid-90s. So in the middle of the 90s, we had a rational unified process that we should follow when we develop software, and we had a unified modeling language that we could use. We even had stuff like the 4+1 view model to illustrate sort of like different aspects of the software system from different angles. And then we had the patterns movement, which is interesting. This took inspiration from a real buildings architect, Christopher Alexander. Maybe some of you have read some of his books. They're kind of interesting. There was much hope, I think, in sort of identifying recurring problems and known solution to known problems in known context, and to use those to compose sort of like better systems with better architecture. The most prevalent and most well-known of these patterns was identified in 1997. This is the big ball of mud. Now, unfortunately, everyone has heard of this. Very few have read sort of like the description by Foot and Yoder that you can find on this link. And this is a shame, but I guess it's unavoidable. We sort of live in this pop culture, like where the soundbite survives and the analysis sort of like dies. But I'd like to encourage you to read this. It's very interesting, and it also gives you, it's also like a historical document in the sense that it gives you some insight into how they were thinking about architecture back in the 90s. So since the earliest definitions of architecture, we've seen some scope creep and maybe some even bigger ambitions for what architecture should be about. So from talking about these structures and components and interfaces, we started talking more about like properties of the system that we want to build, like testability and security and reliability and resilience and so on and so forth. So this is a different definition, which is much more abstract in a sense, and it talks about other stuff than these components and their interfaces. It talks about people and even about money. So it says, architecture represents the significant design decisions that shape the form and function of the system, where significant is measured by the cost of change. This is a definition by Grady Booch. I'm not exactly sure what year this is from, but I think Grady Booch probably still promotes a definition along these lines, so maybe that's okay. Okay, so many definitions of architecture. How did it go? The decade of software architecture was over. We're approaching the 2000s. Well, it didn't turn out so well. At least in my narrative, right? Architecture was killed in its sleep by the assassin known as Agile in the effort to overthrow the evil ruler called Waterfall. But why? Why did this happen? And to understand why architecture was killed or attempted to kill by Agile, we're going to have to talk about some uncomfortable things. Right? It's important to talk about uncomfortable things because uncomfortable things are presumably the things that don't work so well, and that's where we might improve. And I think the problem with architecture had to do with irrelevance and harm. And I'm not going to say that there was no good architecture work in the 90s. Of course there was, right? But at the same time, many people experienced architecture and architects as useless in the best case, right? And actively harmful in the worst case. And I've spoken to many people during my career, many developers, who've said that they've never experienced working for an architect that did more good than harm. And this is like a disaster for the field of architecture. And it's very tempting to sort of, well, there's something wrong about these developers, right? The developers who expressed this opinion have been among some of the best developers that I've ever met, right? And it's too easy to blame the messenger. We should sort of like listen to the message instead. But again, how could this possibly happen, right? Architecture sounds good, right? It tries to address important things about building software. One thing we might ask is why did we sort of get an architect to do this architecture work? One possible answer to that is that we want some sort of conceptual integrity, right? For the system. We want it ideally to be sort of like the brainchild of a single person, if you like. So that's a reasonable reason, I guess. There's also this notion of the master builder who has like minions to carry out sort of like the menial task of implementation, and then you can sort of like draw the big system, which points in an entirely different direction, which has to do with economics, because skill and knowledge is expensive. It's much cheaper if you can have like one expensive architect in the middle, and then you have a bunch of like code monkeys to carry out the implementation, right? To sort of multiply the impact of that expensive person. So unfortunately, I think in many cases, the role of architecture was sort of set up in sort of like an anti-pattern. So here we have like 8 teams of developers and an architect that is served by an architect in the middle. Or even worse, maybe it's like an architectural board. There are a bunch of problems with this arrangement. First off, you directly set up the architect to become a bottleneck. Right? And communication is asynchronous. Teams have to wait for clarifications and decisions. It's slow and also unpredictable. All sort of like asynchronous calls have the possibility of timing out, so you get no response at all. This happens. And it's sort of also like detached from reality, because the architect is sort of like set outside the context of the team. So he cannot know the context of the teams as well as the teams do. Which leads potentially to poor decisions, and poor decisions in turn leads to loss of trust. This is very bad. And there are also like direct conflicts of interest, or maybe more like conflicts of goals, right? So you have two sides, you have the team and the architect. For architecture decisions, the team are interested in decisions that are, let's see, local, specific, and internally legible. Right? So you want it to sort of apply to your local context. You want it to be specific in the sense that it solves exactly your problem. It doesn't have to solve any other problem. In fact, it might be worse that if it solves also other problems. And it needs to be sort of like legibly from the inside. Right? So it needs to be understandable for the people working inside the system. That's the most important thing. Whereas for the architect, it's very different. It's like the direct opposite. Right? So it's better, for an architect, it's better to have a global decision or a solution that sort of spans multiple solutions. Right? A generic solution is better than a specific one, and it needs to be understandable from the outside because the architect is positioned on the outside. And this here is not a recipe for success. But it's important to note that these are all systemic problems. This is not to say that architects were doing a bad job or developers were doing a bad job or something like that, but it's more to say that this was a bad arrangement that led to some bad results. And then Agile happened, and I said that Agile was an assassin. That's probably more like a revolution. Right? And practically, at least it seemed, overnight we got this Agile manifesto for software development, which says individuals and interactions over process and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. Which is actually kind of nuanced, which is rare, I guess, in discussions about software, in that this talks about sort of like relative value. It doesn't really say that anything is bad, it just says these things are even more important than these other things. And of course, nuance very quickly gets lost. And you can see that this spells trouble for the software architect who might be interested in some of these things that are now stricken out. Okay, how did it go with Agile? What happened with Agile? In practice, when the smoke settled out, emerged Scrum and Jira. And Scrum and Jira, as you will notice, is a process and a tool. And this is like literally the first item in the manifesto. But oh well, you know, these things happen. We can see some tendencies in the industry, perhaps, from this. Maybe we should learn something from that as well. But I want to talk a little bit more about Scrum, but I think understanding Scrum and the history of Scrum is important for the story of Agile. Now, Scrum, very early on, emerged as the winner in sort of like a competition to find lightweight processes for software developers to follow, for software teams to follow. And this was, I didn't know this until fairly recently, but apparently Scrum very deliberately set out to make a deal in hostile environment. Right? I came across this old thread by Alistair Coburn, and the most startling post, at least to me, was this one. It says that Scrum struck a magnificent bargain in hostile territory. Management got 12 times per year, once per month, that is your sprint, right? To change direction in any way they wanted. The team got 1 month of total quiet time with no interruptions or changes in direction to do the heavy thinking and working. So this was like mind-blowing to me. What really happened, you have like deliberately set out to to function in a hostile environment. So this very interesting sort of like pact or contract between your hard-pushing executives who want to extract value from the software team and the developers needing time to do the actual work. This here is sort of like set out to be like a compromise. So the idea is to create this sort of like productive terrarium. This is sort of like how I like to think about it. That you're sort of like trying to shelter the software team from the hostile environment outside because there's so much noise and stuff out there. And then you try to control and optimize sort of like the conditions inside the terrarium, right? Avoiding too much or too little of everything. Making sure that sort of like the busy little silkworms inside are thriving, hopefully producing a lot of silk. Right? And you're sort of exerting this mild pressure that maybe you could produce a little more silk this month because we really need it, and have you set your stretch goals and yada yada. So this is the terrarium model of software development. So again, we have two sides. On the one hand, you have the software team who will produce features in exchange for protection from the external environment, and then you have on the other side, you have someone who are willing to offer protection in exchange for features. Now, you notice there's an asterisk there. It says some sort of like conditions apply. Right? For instance, the team might have to follow certain rituals and practices, such as those dictated by Scrum. Yes. Now, an interesting thing here is that this seems like a fair trade in a sense, but a thing about software is that as you progressively accumulate features, you also typically accumulate technical debt and stuff like that, so it gets harder over time to produce more silk. That means that sort of the productivity might be declining, and then something bad can happen to the willingness to protect the team from the environment. But okay, that was 20 years ago. What has happened to Agile since then? Has nothing happened? And I think my view is that we're still mostly living inside this terrarium. So, but in a sense, it's not true that nothing has happened. We've seen scope creep for Agile as well. We started out with, we had the manifesto for Agile software development. And this has sort of like evolved into more like Agile product development, or even ambitions to have like Agile organizations that can sort of tackle change well because we want to be nimble and be agile with the way we do business. And this is sort of like raising the stakes for every step. And to help in this, we have seen an endless stream of like good advice coming out of Silicon Valley, where in a sense the winners of capitalism have written down the recipes for success, like confirmation bias be damned. We did this and we were very successful. Maybe if you do the same thing, you will be very successful as well. Of course, that's not logically valid, but you can sort of see why they would say something like that, in particular if they want to sell books. But okay, so they're selling these various kinds of what I like to call radical pixie dust that you can sort of sprinkle on top of your Agile transformation in hope that something magical will happen and you will fulfill the Agile dream. And that would be nice if that would happen. Has it worked? I think we can say that we've honestly tried. We've tried to do this. We've tried to take different tools that are sort of pushed by these books and try to apply them to our settings. And the problem in talking about this is that, in a sense, everything is a success until it's abandoned. Right? I've been using the example of OKRs. Right? At least a couple of years ago, when people talked about OKRs, everyone was very enthusiastic. So we're using OKRs, and they're really great for us, and it really works. It's getting more silent now. And so I think maybe the time is ripe to disrupt the practice of OKRs. And the purpose of saying this is not to dunk on OKRs. It's just a tool. You can apply it well. It might work well for you. But there's this thing that we're trying different approaches, and then they sort of vanish over time. Very little seems to stick around. Whereas this terrarium model, it seems to be very stable. And for this reason, things have gotten a bit weird. In a sense, the ideals have evolved greatly. Right? So we know that we should be bridging the gap between business and IT. We know that we should be customer obsessed like Amazon used to be in the old days, right? Let's see. Developers should grab a seat at the table and be involved in strategy decisions and all that stuff. And these are all good things. We should be doing these things. These are good ideals. But it seems to me that the reality, unfortunately, is still largely the same, still largely the Scrum Pact. Now, you might wonder, what is the problem with this arrangement? It's set out deliberately to create this terrarium. Why do I say that it's a problem? The problem with the terrarium, the main problem, is the same as its source of strength, which is the isolation. Right? You cannot communicate effectively with the rest of the organization if you deliberately say that we're not going to do that. That means that feedback must be brought by a special messenger who is able to sort of move between the different worlds, right? The world of the terrarium and the world of the business. So communication happens through these mediums. Right? And I'm sure, I suppose probably some of you in this room work as mediums, and you probably don't think of yourselves like that, but that's sort of like how I think about it. You wouldn't use that word, but that's the word I'm using. And some of you are really good at this, by the way, right? So you're excellent at moving between different worlds and communicating well with people in both realms, if you like, right? But there is nothing you can really do to sort of counter the fact that it is asynchronous, it is a lossy kind of communication, and it's not direct. And it's sort of like the telephone game, right? So some information may be warped along the way. So there are some uncomfortable truths about Agile as well. I think that in a sense, software developers have learned by heart the ideals of Agile, and even the sort of like ambitious, like Marty Kagan style digital product development Agile stuff. I think developers prefer the protection of the terrarium, right? Because life as a silkworm is quite comfortable. Real silkworms consume something, they feed on mulberry leaves, and developers feed on Jira tickets, and it's much the same thing. And it's also nice in the sense that if something goes wrong, you can sort of always blame the outside, right? You can always say, like, point to the hostile environment, said they didn't let us do this or that. And that might be true, but it's also sort of like abdicating your responsibility. Right? So there's this quote I like by our famous playwright Henrik Ibsen, who said, "Don't use that foreign word ideals, we have the excellent native word lies." Okay, so now we're in a bad position. I said that architecture is dead, Agile isn't agile. What should we do? This is sort of like a depressing point to be at. We can't sort of end the talk here. That would be too sad. So I think we should go back to the problem again. And I think the biggest, at least to me, the biggest problem, the biggest unsolved problem, and unfortunately the unsolvable problem in software is the passing of time. Time brings change. And if time would just stand still for a while, or ideally forever, we might eventually catch up and reach a steady state, and our software would be good. Right? But the clock keeps ticking, and when the clock keeps ticking, things keep happening. And some of those things that happen affect the systems that we make. And that means that the systems, in turn, must change to reflect this new reality. The problem is that code is dead. I realize I'm saying that everything is dead except me. Architecture is dead, Agile is dead. The code is really dead. The code cannot do anything, right? It's completely static. And it's up to us as humans, because we are alive, to make it seem like the code is alive in some sense. And the way that I think about this is a scene from a movie called Night on Earth. And the guy on the right is a taxi driver, and the guy on the left is a dead priest. And what has happened is that the priest took a ride with the taxi driver, and then the taxi driver started making all these crazy confessions involving like a watermelon and a sheep and his brother's wife, and it got too much for the priest, so he had a heart attack and died. And then the taxi driver realized, this is a very bad situation for me. I cannot be found with a dead priest in my taxi, so he tries to set him on a park bench. So it seems that he's just sleeping on a park bench, and then if someone discovers later on that he's dead, that's not his problem. And the problem, of course, is that corpses are kind of heavy to move, and they're not very good at sitting. So I'm proposing that the programmer is the taxi driver, and the code is like the dead priest. This here is the software system. If you ever hear someone talk about socio-technical systems, this is the thing. This is what you should be thinking about. So in a very real sense, software systems are like these cyborg systems. And we know this instinctively, because if we depend on a library and then the maintainer of the library sort of like stops maintaining the library, everyone panics, right? We start scrambling for alternatives because that library is dead. So changes must be responded to by people, at least most changes. And we like to say change is constant because it sounds a little bit clever. Right? And it's true, there will always be changes because there will always be the ticking of time. But what about the amount of change? Is that constant too? Can we influence the amount of change? And where do the changes that affect our systems come from? What kinds of changes are we talking about? How often do things change? What is the rate of change? What are the different sources of change that affect our system? How exposed is our system to change? What is the change surface? Maybe we can start talking about these things. And we often distinguish between necessary and accidental complexity. I think we can do the same thing with change. And this is important to do because we have a limited capacity to handle change. So we want to make sure that we prioritize the changes that are really important. Now, typically, when we speak of changes, we think of changes that affect the code. There are also changes that affect the team directly, which in turn affects their capacity to handle change. We'll sort of get back to that later. But first, changes that affect the code. We often think about changing requirements. Maybe the business domain can change in some way. But of course, technology changes all the time as well. And in fact, technology often changes much more rapidly than the domain. So today, most applications are these iceberg applications, right? We have a little bit of our code on top. This is the visible part. And we have this deep, murky part underneath. And sort of the bizarre reality of it, and sort of dirty secret, that is we don't necessarily know what's in there. Right? There's a lot of stuff. All the set of all our transient dependencies. And we can figure out what it is. Right? We can ask our packet manager exactly what did you download. But it's important because, in a sense, all these transient dependencies are part of our system now. And if there is something that changes one of those dependencies, we might have to respond to it. It's important because every dependency that we have is, in a sense, a subscription to a stream of possible changes. Everything of those things can change. And all changes to a dependency are in the accidental category, because we could have chosen something else. It's not sort of intrinsic to the problem that we're solving. I think it's worth reflecting over what is the percentage of time spent of essential changes versus accidental changes. And we should work to reduce exposure to accidental changes if we can. And again, the reason for doing that is that we want to protect our capacity for change. So if we want to sort of, if we return to the problem that we're trying to solve, we want to build these sustainable cyborgs that can live for a long time and survive even though time exists and change happen. An important thing to note in that context is that human vices are constant. Right? We are not going to improve. We are the same today that we were yesterday and that we will be tomorrow. We cannot hope for better humans, in a sense. And that means that any solutions that we attempt must be systemic in nature. So things like, we often talk about discipline or professionalism and stuff like that. Those are just euphemisms for trying harder. And we can't really try harder. We try our best. Right? And it's not good enough, so we need to work with the sort of how we arrange things. This is the same thing that we had with the architect and the developers. It was a bad arrangement, we need good arrangements. Okay, so what do I think we should do? Let's start at the organization level. I would like to see us try to move beyond this terrarium, right? At least if we have hopes of reaching this agile dream, either we sort of abandon the agile dream and think that's not what we're going to do. Otherwise, I think we need to move outside the terrarium. That means that the teams need to be self-sustaining in some sense. I'd like to think of teams as tiny organizations in their own right. And then sort of the larger organization is a loosely coupled alliance between these smaller organizations. Now, if that's going to work, we need to give actual meaningful autonomy and independence to the teams. And that includes radical notions like changing sort of the mission of the team, or even dissolving the team. So we're not producing the value that we should be producing. We're going to dissolve and then sort of reform to do something else. And to do that, you need to move the money inside the team boundary, give the team a budget. Obviously, you need to put non-technical people inside the team. Organizations are getting much better at this, and this is a good thing. So we're sort of learning that teams should be cross-functional. That's a good thing. We need also real significant business decisions inside the teams. And I'm not talking about decisions like, should we use Java or Kotlin for this? And it's the most insignificant decision in the world. Only developers sort of care about that. And it's not a business decision. The teams need to engage in direct communication. That means direct communication, not through a medium, direct communication with stakeholders. That means knowing and establishing relationships with the stakeholders as well. And the same goes for customers. If the team needs to communicate, it cannot happen through a medium, and I can't really wait for a sprint. And it's important because without direct communication, we don't really have feedback. Feedback is a bluff. And if there's no feedback, we really don't have any agile. At the team level, teams should seek independence. One way to do that is to try to minimize these dependencies. If you take on a dependency, it always comes with a cost. It always comes with a stream of changes. So you need to make sure that the benefits that you get are significant, that they clearly offset the cost of having that dependencies. You need a significant benefit that would be hard to obtain otherwise. You should write simple things for yourself. Don't mean roll your own crypto. I mean do write your own left pad. You can do that. I have faith in you, right? You should protect your internals. This is basically just encapsulation, but it's very important so that you're free to change without having to coordinate with others, without having to fear that you're affecting others in some way. Knowledge loss is an important problem. I mentioned this about changes that affect the team's capacity to handle other changes. Knowledge loss is a problem in this sense. Systems tend to outlive the people who work on them. Right? People come and go, so you need to work to actively retain and rebuild the knowledge necessary to own the system well. Best sort of approach I know is to work in groups, pairs or mobs or ensembles or the whole team for that matter. This is the only sort of kind of knowledge transfer that I've seen sort of actually work. At the architectural level, I'm going to, I have an architect title, but I'm going to side mostly with the teams here. Right? I think this is a bit flippant, but architecture is too important to be left to architects alone. It really belongs to the teams, I think. The most important thing is to take into account the local context. An architectural decision that doesn't take into account local context is going to be bad, and the team will be fighting its own system. It's a very bad situation to be in. And it's important that it solves the specific problem as well as possible. And it needs to be inside, sort of understandable from the inside, right? If it's also understandable from the outside, that's great, right? And it doesn't really have to be one or the other. But this is one of those, while we value external legibility, we value internal legibility more. It's okay if there are sort of like constraints that are external to the team that the team needs to sort of interact with and be aware of. For instance, if you have a larger organization, maybe you have some compliance stuff that you need to sort of, someone owns those constraints in a sense, and the teams should be able to work with that, but it means that the team will have to communicate, obviously, with those who own those constraints. And they might have to engage in some kind of negotiation, and it's fine. They might also have to go through some sort of review process, but the team should be able to work with that. And of course, the ones who own these constraints also should expect to work directly with teams and not sort of expect that teams will sort of magically follow and obey these constraints on their own. Development should be observability driven. I very strongly believe that your software doesn't have any quality attributes that have not been like recently validated in production. You might think you have, you might wish you have, but until you've sort of seen it happen, you don't really have those qualities. It's a good idea to broadcast the state of your system in some way, and this can really help also with making your system externally legible, more understandable to the architects on the outside. We should strive for simplicity, but we need to be serious about it. We always talk about like keep it simple, stupid, and we don't manage to keep it simple. We should minimize the moving parts of the system. The simplest system is the one with the fewest parts. And we should be very careful with sophistication. Never go for sophistication unless you absolutely have to. Now, the problem with complexity in software is that it never introduces itself as complexity. It says, I am sophisticated. You should go brutalist. You need to see what's there. So don't hide things under layers of abstractions. It's important to sort of get to the real stuff. We should work to reduce the change surface of our system, shrink this iceberg, have more of our stuff. So that brings us to the summary. First of all, it's not a balance between agility and architecture. You do what works, do more of the stuff that seems to work. Architecture belongs in teams. You might have architects that sort of facilitate architecture work, that's fine, but teams need ownership to architecture. We should smash the terrarium and engage with the whole organization. We should work to shrink the iceberg to conserve our ability to handle change, and hopefully this allows us to build more sustainable cyborgs. Yes, that's it. Thank you.